Welcome to All About Data on Federal News Network. Now your host, Jory Heckman.
Thanks for joining me this week on All About Data, a conversation with chief data officers and the people who are making data work better in government. On today's episode, we have an exit interview with former Assistant IG for Cyber Assessments and Data Analytics at the Energy Department, Kshemendra Paul. This interview was recorded back in May.
Kshemendra, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me on your show.
Of course. Well, I guess let's address the first things first here. I understand this is an exit interview of sorts. You're leaving federal service after a long and illustrious career, and it's taken you to a couple of agencies. Would you mind just giving us a quick recap of all the places you've been and all the things you've done there?
Oh, yeah. That's thank you for that. And just to underscore it, I'm speaking in my personal capacity, not expressing the views of DOE, OIG, or any government agency. Like a lot of folks, I came into federal service post 9/11 wanting to be a part of the solution. Took a pay cut. I left a career in the private sector that was heavily weighted towards entrepreneurial and tech innovation type endeavors. I came into the Department of Justice to be their chief enterprise architect, was able to use product management sensibility developed in the private sector to help the Department of Justice rationalize its enterprise architecture and see pathways towards streamlining, improving efficiency and effectiveness. An early win was when I was asked to lead the National Information Exchange Model effort with DHS and state and local partners. Got that done. That's still now the leading semantic interoperability framework, or Rosetta Stone, if you like, for information sharing. It's used internationally by all 50 states and many federal agencies. Based on that, I got pulled up to OMB as the federal chief architect. Was there for 2 years, two administrations, 3 years, 4 budgets. I was designated by the president in 2010 as the government-wide lead for information sharing with a primary but not exclusive focus on the domestic counterterrorism architecture. Work closely with state and local agencies, federal partners to knit together an information sharing environment, make operational connections, mature the national network of fusion centers, which is quite interesting. It's the only national security asset that's not owned by the federal government. It's owned by the states or localities and primarily funded by them and operated by them, of course, with some assistance from the federal government. A little later, I was the inaugural chief data officer at the Department of Veterans Affairs. That was a great run and able to advance not only data strategy there, but build out a common operating picture, an enterprise information model underneath, a digital twin, if you like, of VA's business infrastructure and veteran-facing activities. I ran the corporate clearinghouse of statistical and predictive analytics, veterans and VA business. And then my last role was as an inspector general. Quite interesting after a run on the agency side, coming over to the oversight side and being able to really integrate that sensibility in a deep way.
Yeah, you've really covered quite a lot of ground here. This has been, I think, an interesting arc. You've had this career in the federal service at a time where the data maturity at a lot of these agencies has come a long way. Things have really developed. We've seen landmark bills like the Evidence Act really kind of make data as a strategic asset the guiding principle for a lot of these agencies. There have been more chief data officers at these agencies. It's a lot to ask of you here, but what would you make of the growth of data as a discipline across the federal government in the time you've been part of the federal government?
Yeah, you're right to highlight that. I talk about the NEAM, that kind of bookends it. It was the leading implementation of the Federal Enterprise Architecture Data Reference Model. That's that first wave of activity post Clinger-Cohen, post the eGov Act. So that was really, sort of a shining beacon at that time. That was a long time ago. And then with Evidence Act, which I think is a great piece of legislation, there's been amazing implementation across the departments and agencies. I had the privilege to be a leader in the Federal Chief Data Officers Council when I was at VA. I led the large agency committee of the council, and I saw up close and have subsequently tracked their work. And, it's interesting, the killer app that's come out of Evidence Act implementation has been, data analytics for policy analysis and operational decision support. Think CXO dashboards. The work over at agriculture, but I referenced some of the work I did at VA, a lot of the stuff out of DOD with Advana. That's really been the killer app. And it's interesting. I can talk a little bit more about that arc, but I want to sort of use this to sort of make the point. That article you referenced that I published in Federal News Network back in December about government reform starts with data and evidence. Kind of the key idea there was use the Evidence Act infrastructure, the nascent progress, the guidance out of OMB, the agency-based progress, and aim it at the management of the federal government, its departments, its agencies, and its programs. And, kind of work towards that single source of truth, using effective data governance, getting to that authoritative transactional data, use artificial intelligence to ingest, semi-structured information in IG and GA reports, in program evaluations, information that's really buried at the program level, but could be used, to support meta-analysis at the enterprise level. So it's interesting to see that maturation. What I just described wasn't possible 20 years ago when we rebuilt the NEAM, which is really focused on, interface control documents, if you like, and adding the idea of semantic interoperability into the 1990s concept of interface control documents. Today, you can actually think about ingesting authoritative data out of transactional systems, come as you are, not have to standardize it a priori. Sure, if you have ontologies, if you have taxonomies, that's great, but that's a data governance kind of function, and you can really do so much more today than you could in the past. The federal implementation is uneven, right? So I think the federal government has a lot of gaps in how it uses data and technology to manage itself. That, I'm speaking now what I learned as an IG for 2 years, right? It's, there's some progress, but challenges remain, using that famous tagline.
Yeah, you're borrowing a page from the Government Accountability Office with the idea of more progress made, but more progress needed. But I think you're really getting at a key point here, Kshemendra, which is just that this data and evidence has really been the bread and butter of the IG community when it comes to rooting out fraud, waste, and abuse. Every agency really wants to keep their eye on that, make sure that they're doing everything they can to address these things and flag them when there are kind of anomalous payments potentially going out the door. In your most recent role, I imagine that came up quite a bit. Can you maybe discuss how data was a key part of your work over at DOE?
Yeah, I can do that. And again, I'll remind your listeners, I'm not speaking on behalf of DOE OIG, but I will refer to some of their products, which are public information, and make sure I stay within the four corners of that public information. So, looking back to when I was on the job, the DOE OIG was quite critical of the Department of Energy and their lack of use of authoritative data, data analytics in its management of its programs and operations. We highlighted that a report that my organization published while I was still on the job, DOE-OIG-25-05, I think, maybe 05 or 06. That basically, it's got a long title, but DOE, the department should invest in and implement enterprise-wide data analytics to reduce risk in its budget proposals, something like that. And that report, I basically highlighted that the OIG highlighted that the department had big gaps between its risk management process, its budgeting process, and its data process. In layman's terms, it was a compliance theater. The answer is use data, right? And don't make it up, and don't pretend like you're Bill Murray in Groundhog Day and every day's a new day. And, but use data and, force yourself to be accountable at that and, have enterprise metrics about your key risks. And, so don't just do risk identification, but actually manage your risks by using that authoritative data.
And, I think an emerging kind of idea at a lot of these agencies is that data is the responsibility of more than just the chief data officer. It is kind of a community around that person, that there really are these data stewards who are the ones creating the data and making sure that there are kind of good data hygiene principles in place so that the data is, actionable, right? It's something that is of good quality that you guys can then kind of drive these analytics, drive these insights. I imagine this is something else that has also had an interesting kind of historical arc to it in the past, say a couple of decades. Kshemendra, can you speak to that at all? Yeah,
I can. You're exactly right, Jory. I'll book of this. When I'm in the big innovation with NEAM, at the time it was breakthrough, about the semantic modeling, but but it was the idea of federated governance. How do you make federated governance work between the Department of Justice and its law enforcement mission, its public safety mission, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Defense, Department of State, other federal agencies, state and local agencies. They all have their own needs, but they have to come together on common minimum standards. And how do you govern that? How do you make that operational? Well, NEAM was solved that problem for its, scope, but it was pretty innovative at the time about how you do that and how you use technical modeling and approaches for information and data to, match that, kind of governance scope. Well, at the time, a key collaborator of mine was an excellent data professional, Donna Roy, who was over at DHS. And she took over leadership of NEAM from me when I moved up to OMB. And she talked about how it was a community-based approach, right? And really emphasized community and really state and local community as prime first-rank members. That was something new for a federal program, right? To be able to share governance in that way. That's not normally how the federal government works with state and local partners. So that's kind of one bookend. And then, coming up now, and, Rob King was the chief data officer at DOE, and I'd worked with Rob in the past. He was a CDO at SSA when I was the CDO at VA, and prior he was at DHS. He built something there called the Management Cube, an earlier version of data analytics. But Rob talked about how it takes a village, and he was really focused on building bottom-up community at DOE, which is famously distributed and decentralized with the national labs that, all do their own thing. So community is really important. And I bring this back. I have a thesis that I'll share with you, Jory, which is, you have data governance, and that was highlighted in Evidence Act, and you were just talking about that. And, now you have AI governance, right? And, you're going to government, the current strategy seems to be, hire robots, but you need to have governance over that. And, it needs to be linked to the data governance. That was a point that we were critical of the Department of Energy, at least the IG was when they were writing reports. We put that pretty prominently in the annual management challenge as well. I think that data governance, AI governance, and enterprise governance are going to converge in some way, right? As data and AI continue to be such a central part of delivering services to citizens and managing government resources, you have to tie the governance of those together in some way. What that exactly looks like, I think, will be emergent over the next few years, and they're going to depend on the operating models and the mission space of different agencies. But I really think that convergence is going to happen. And to your point, it's not on the CDO or the chief AI officer or the CIO to sort of be in charge of everybody. It's, folks have to come together under agency and department leadership, under White House leadership, to make that work.
And you brought up the magic buzzword here, Kshemendra, the idea of AI really is kind of caught wildfire at a lot of these agencies. They're thinking big about what AI can do for mission to make them more productive. But I think you hit the nail on the head here that really a lot of what they're proposing, what they're thinking about, really does come down to these basic data hygiene principles, making sure the data is in usable shape before you put the cart before the horse, so to speak.
You're so right. I think there's not a way around that because you have overlapping policy issues, privacy, cybersecurity. The quality of data is a function of the quality of data governance, which oversees the stewardship and data management activities. And you're trying to answer an enterprise level key analytic question to do policy analysis or develop a KPI or, make budgeting decisions. And, you got to have, that sort of global view. And so that's where I keep going back to, I don't see a way where you can avoid that convergence, and it's just, you need it. And the operating models for that sort of an enterprise, I don't think they exist yet. At least I haven't found them, and I've looked. It's interesting. The most advanced description of enterprise governance that I've seen anywhere in the federal space comes out as the cybersecurity write-ups. Some of the NIST documents talk about governance, and as you know, cybersecurity and governance are key ideas, and the data community, it borrows from the cybersecurity community, and there's adjacency there, especially as you think about zero trust. But, Yeah, I think that's a frontier for the colleagues that I'm leaving behind in the government, and hopefully those of us outside can help influence that conversation about what does that look like.
I wanted to shift gears a little bit and talk about data sharing because, oftentimes we hear so much about data silos within agencies, the need to share data across agencies, and that can always be easier said than done, right? I mean, sometimes these data sharing agreements can take quite a while to hash out, and it can be tricky to manage these things. And so, Kshemendra, how have you seen that improve over time? Has it improved? What are your thoughts there?
I think it has improved. I think the advances post 9/11 were systemic. I think coming out of the High Tech Act, that was, and the Recovery Act after the global financial crisis, there were some health information sharing reforms, and they've continued. The idea of information blockage, information sharing mandates with the AHRs have gotten progressively stronger. In the defense arena, there's a lot more sharing going on. The data decrees that came out a number of years ago. So I do see a lot of improvements with information sharing. There is a degree of parochialism, and there is a degree of what I call gratuitous variation in information sharing agreements that continue to hinder. People sometimes look at information policy as a Gordian knot, right? That, and you can use this sword of Damocles. If you're Alexander the Great, or you can use a chainsaw. My experience has been, as painful as it is, the majority of times, there are policy issues that you can work through if you have a clear business need that you can articulate. So if you can really work back from what are the key analytic questions, what are the mission drivers, in most cases, you can get to a valid, access that's policy compliant. In many cases, maybe not all cases. There's, certainly cases where it's legally prohibited, but, there's a lot of, in these information sharing agreements, they all look at the same laws. In many cases, there are sometimes specific laws. They have local interpretations that they then codify in PDF documents, then become impediments when, really it's local aesthetics that drove those agreements, not really, a concrete, kind of representation of the law. A place where people are solving this problem is in cybersecurity. There's a lot of movement, the FedRAMP movement towards continuous authorization and being able to, kind of put that on industry. A lot of that's driven by work that NIST has been doing over the years, something called OSCAL. It's basically saying, write your policy in a machine-readable way using a standard taxonomy, right? And then we can start to make these agreements machine-readable and then automate them and get rid of a lot of the barriers where, that exist. So I think we've made progress, and I think there's a whole wave of progress that's teed up, right, where these ideas of the leading practice of, writing these agreements in a machine-readable way using a standard taxonomy are poised to really go from just cybersecurity as the cutting edge for that kind of thinking into, other domains of policy that underpin the Gordian knot of, data access and appropriate use.
I wanted to go full circle and reference something you mentioned earlier about data kind of being the killer app for decision support, how there are so many of these dashboards now that secretary, the assistant secretary, folks below them, you really do rely on for day-to-day policy decisions. It seems like what had once been kind of a back office kind of thing has really caught the attention of leadership at these agencies, and that it really does, to the whole point of the Evidence Act, really does drive data as a strategic tool and, driving that decision making. It seems like a fairly remarkable thing that has happened in a relatively small amount of time.
It's underappreciated. It really is. The major outcome of Evidence Act and the federal data strategy is what you're describing, right? These CXO dashboards, the use of data analytics, right? Not old school data warehousing, which is maybe a decade old, 15 years old, but the modern approaches with a data lake and, a single source of truth and enterprise data repository and the like. That was unanticipated. Evidence Act originally was focused on program evaluation, which is long-term, evaluate a program so that we can better design it, building evidence, gold standard, randomized control trials, that sort of thing. There is progress with that. That's worthy and noble work, but the killer app is really decision support at the speed of relevance, policy analysis, operational decision support. And I think, program stovepiping is alive and well, but probably more insidious is functional stovepiping. The fact that the risk folks don't talk to the budgeting folks, don't talk to the financial folks, don't talk to the acquisition folks, HR, IT, they're all in stovepipes. And, that's really the promise of Klinger-Cohen and eGov and, the management side of OMB is bringing together the management of government. And kind of that's where I think the real opportunity lies. And the technology is there. Leading practices are there now. So, I'm actually fairly bullish about, what lies ahead, in terms of, getting on that problem.
Kshemendra, we've been talking so much about the past. We've been talking about the present. Let's talk about the future here. Speculative by nature here, I know. But, where do you see this space going in the not so distant future? We are talking about things like AI. We're talking about, generative AI, other emerging technology. There's a lot on the horizon here. What excites you about what's coming up? What do you think is possible for federal agencies to really better harness their data going forward?
I'm really excited about the possibility that data-first architectures will come to the fore. Right? As much as we've talked about the importance of data, we spend money on systems. We buy technology and vendor relationships, and that reinforces program and functional stovepiping in a fractal way. I think that if we can, kind of get a narrow portfolio of federal-wide priorities, high-value, high-priority initiatives around better management of government, as we've been talking about, that can provide shade to an effort to create that kind of single source of truth at the program level, the agency level, and the federal enterprise level, and reuse that data that's integrated once, curated once, seamlessly and policy compliant, reused many times. If you can do that, if you can improve the quality of data against key analytic questions and applications at the enterprise level, at the department level, not just at the program level, you unlock new possibilities for getting rid of technical debt, depreciating legacy technology, getting away from vendor lock, dramatically reducing the cost of technology and that spend. As we know, that's a huge problem for the government, right? More and more money going into the black hole of IT modernization. So I think I'm really excited about that. And, the value proposition of a data-first approach versus a technology-first approach.
That was former Assistant IG for Cyber Assessments and Data Analytics at the Energy Department, Kshemendra Paul. You can find more data coverage at federalnewsnetwork.com. I'm Jory Heckman, and thanks for listening to this episode of All About Data.
Thanks for listening to All About Data on Federal News Radio, part of Federal News Network. You can listen to this episode and past episodes anytime in your favorite podcast app. Search for All About Data on Podcast One, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your shows.